I want to begin today by reading you a list, not a clinical list, not an academic list, a list of things that people have actually said to people who came to me for grief therapy, people carrying what they were calling in this series living death grief. Things said to them by friends, by family members, by colleagues, by well-meaning people who genuinely wanted to help and who instead added to the injury. Nobody died, so why are you still not over this? At least you got out before you wasted any more years. You can always make more money. It was just a job. You're still young enough to start again. You should have seen it coming. I never liked them anyway. Everything happens for a reason. Think of how much worse it could have been. God has a plan. You need to stop living in the past. Other people have it much worse. Imagine how embarrassing this is for your family. You gave him too much power. You were too trusting. You let this happen. I want to pause on that list for a moment. Not to analyze it immediately, but just to let it sit there and be acknowledged. Because if you are someone who has carried a living death, the betrayal, the financial ruin, the identity collapse, the shattered assumed world, you have probably heard most of these. And the cumulative effect of hearing them repeatedly from people who are supposed to care about you is not minor. It is not a supplementary inconvenience added to the primary grief. It is in many cases its own category of harm. Welcome to the Grief Lab. I am Sylvia Chen. New episodes every week on Spotify and YouTube. We are in the middle of the series on living death grief, the grief that has no funeral, no cultural acknowledgement, and no social support structure. If this series is naming something real for you, please subscribe, share it, and leave a rating. Every share puts this conversation in front of someone who is currently being told that what they are carrying is not real enough to grieve. Today, we are going deep into the concept of disenfranchised grief. We introduced it in the last episode, the work of Kenneth Doka, but today I want to spend the full episode unpacking it because I think understanding precisely why your grief is being disenfranchised and what the mechanisms of that disenfranchisement are is one of the most important things I can offer you. Not because understanding it makes it hurt less immediately, but because it relocates the problem. It moves the failure from you to the culture, and that relocation, the recognition that the inadequacy is in the social response, not in the grieving person, is the beginning of taking your grief seriously, which is the beginning of everything else. Kenneth Doka introduced the concept of disenfranchised grief in 1989 in his book, Disenfranchised Grief, Recognizing Hidden Sorrow. He updated and expanded it substantially in 2002, a volume called Disenfranchised Grief, New Directions, Challenges, and Strategies for Practice. Now, his central argument was this. Society has an implicit grief hierarchy, not a written one, not a formally declared one, but a deeply embedded, culturally enforced hierarchy of which losses are considered real enough, significant enough, and legitimate enough to receive the full social support apparatus of recognized grief. And everything else, every loss that falls outside that narrow cultural definition of what constitutes a real loss is left to be carried by the griever alone, without witness, without ritual, without the community acknowledgement that transforms private suffering into shared sorrow. At the top of the hierarchy, in most Western and many non Western cultural frameworks, sits the death of an immediate family member, a spouse, a parent, a child, through natural causes after a full life. This loss is universally recognized. It triggers the full machinery of social grief support. The condolences, the time off work, the community gathering, the acknowledged period of mourning during which the bereaved person is permitted, even expected, to be not functioning normally. As you move down the hierarchy, the social permission narrows. The death of a pet, the death of an estranged relationship, a miscarriage, a divorce, job loss, financial ruin, the collapse of an identity built on a relationship that turned out to be a performance, the slow destruction of a self by prolonged psychological manipulation, the bankruptcy that followed trusting someone who was systematically betraying that trust. For these losses, the social support apparatus either does not exist or exists in such diminished form as to be functionally useless, and the people carrying them are left not only with the grief itself, but with the additional burden of justifying the grief, of proving to a culture that has already decided it is insufficient that what they are carrying is real enough to warrant the response it is producing. This justification requirement is one of the most damaging features of disenfranchised grief, because grief is not a rational process. It does not respond to the requirement that it be justified before it is permitted. It is already there. It is already in the body, already in the nervous system, already shaping sleep and appetite and concentration and the ability to be present in relationships. And when the grieving person is simultaneously required to manage their grief, which is already consuming enormous psychological resources, and to justify it to a culture that is skeptical of its legitimacy, the combined weight is often overwhelming in a way that neither burden would be alone. I want to name 4 specific mechanisms of which living death grief is disenfranchised in our culture, because I think making them explicit is the first step toward refusing to participate in them. The first mechanism is comparative minimization. This is the response that measures your loss against a loss that would have been worse and uses the comparison to suggest that your grief is disproportionate to the actual harm. Nobody died. At least you got out. Other people have it worse. The implicit logic is grief is only justified when it sits at the top of the suffering scale. And since there is always theoretically something worse that could have happened, there is always a comparative argument available for why your specific loss does not warrant the response it is producing. This logic is not only unkind, it is clinically nonsensical. Grief is not calibrated to the objective severity of a loss on a universal scale of possible losses. It is calibrated to the depth of the attachment and the significance of the assumptive world that was disrupted. A person who loses their entire financial security and their sense of reality simultaneously through the systemic deception of someone they trusted is not helped by being told that at least no one died. The grief response is not proportional to the death count. It is proportional to the shattering, and the shattering was real. The second mechanism is the attribution of culpability. This is the response that locates the grief in the griever's own failure of judgment, of vigilance, of appropriate caution. You should have seen it coming. You were too trusting. You let this happen. The implicit logic is if you had been more competent, more careful, more adequately defended, this would not have happened to you. And therefore, the grief you are experiencing is, in some sense, the consequence of your own inadequacy rather than the consequence of someone else's deliberate choice to deceive and exploit. This mechanism is particularly vicious in the context of financial fraud and psychological manipulation because both of these forms of betrayal specifically target the victim's good faith and their trust, the person who manipulates and defrauds specifically relies on the other person's reasonableness, their willingness to believe the best, their investment in the relationship. The very qualities that are later described as failures of judgment, the trust, the openness, the willingness to be vulnerable, were the qualities that made the relationship possible and that the perpetrator specifically exploited. To locate the grief in the victim's failure of vigilance is to compound the injury with the lie. The third mechanism is temporal pressure. This is the social expectation that grief has a reasonable timeline, after which continued grieving is considered pathological, self-indulgent, or a failure of resilience. The look of slight discomfort when the loss is mentioned 6 months later. The gentle suggestions becoming less gentle over time that it is time to move on. The growing social cost of still being in the grief at a point when the culture around the griever has determined that sufficient time has passed. For living death grief, the temporal pressure is often more intense than for recognized bereavement because the culture shock of unrecognized losses starts from a much lower baseline. You may have 3 days for bereavement leave after the death of a parent. You have exactly 0 days for the discovery that your life partner has been living a double life. And so the expectation that you will be functioning normally resumes immediately, or at most within a few weeks, regardless of what is actually happening in your nervous system. The fourth mechanism is the social discomfort of complexity. The living debts, the betrayals, the financial ruins, the systemic manipulators are complicated stories. They involve living people who may be known to the social community around the griever. They involve legal processes or financial processes or custody arrangements that are ongoing rather than resolved. They involve a perpetrator who may be continuing to operate in the world, may be continuing to be seen as respectable by others, may even be continuing to interact with the griever in contexts where the griever cannot fully escape. And the social community around the griever frequently finds this complexity uncomfortable. It is easier to contact with the source to support a straightforward bereavement than a grief whose landscape involves ongoing contact with the source of harm, or financial entanglement, or the discomfort of acknowledging that someone known to the social group was capable of the betrayal that is being described. And so the social community distances, not always consciously, not always unkindly, but in ways that leave the griever even more isolated than the loss itself created. The friends who gradually stop asking, the family members who change the subject, the colleagues who become slightly uncomfortable when the topic arises, all of them communicating cumulatively that the grief is too complex, too ongoing, too inconvenient to be properly witnessed. What does validation actually look like for disenfranchised grief? Because I do not want to spend this entire episode naming the problem without naming what the alternative is. The first thing that validates disenfranchised grief is naming it explicitly. Saying clearly and without qualification, what happened to you was a real loss. The grief you are experiencing is a real grief. It does not require comparison to a worse loss to be legitimate. It does not require a death certificate. It does not require the approval of anyone who was not in the room where the loss occurred. The naming, the explicit, specific, unhurried naming of what was lost and why it matters is the first act of validation. And it is one of the most powerful things that a therapist, a friend, a community member, or this podcast can offer. The second thing is time without a clock. The explicit permission to still Be in the grief without predetermined endpoint. The communication that the grief will take as long as it takes, that the timeline is not a measure of the griever's health or resilience, and that the people around them will still be there in 6 months when the acute phase has given way to the longer, slower, less visible grief that living death typically produces. The third thing is witnessing without problem solving. The willingness to be present in the grief, to hear it, to hold it, to acknowledge it without immediately reaching for a solution, without the suggestion that a different attitude or a self-help book or a positive reframe or a focus on gratitude will expedite the process. The simple, sustained, patient presence of someone who can be with the grief without needing it to become something more manageable. Let me close with a message that is direct and that I want you to actually receive. The responses you have received that minimized your grief, attributed it to your own failure, imposed a timeline on it, or distanced from its complexity, those responses were wrong. Not unkind necessarily, but wrong. They failed you. Not because the people delivering them were monsters, but because the culture that trained them did not equip them to hold the kind of grief you're carrying. That failure is not yours. The grief is not yours to justify or apologize for or defend. What you lost was real. What was shattered was real. The grief it produced is the accurate, appropriate, neurologically sound response to a person whose assumed world was taken from them. And it is allowed to be exactly as large and as complicated and as long-lasting as it actually is. This has been the Grief Lab. I'm Sylvia Otieno. Every week on Spotify and YouTube, if this episode named the thing that nobody in your life has named, share it with the people who need to understand what you are carrying. It might be the beginning of them finally being able to be present for you.